correspondent Olga Ivshina. Well, joining us now from Washington is Joshua Cohen, who's a former US State Department official with responsibility for economic reform in the Soviet Union, and he's now a columnist for the Moscow Times. Mr. Cohen, welcome to BBC News. Let's just tell you that Reuters are reporting that the Ukraine talks are already over. That's quoting a Kremlin spokesman. We'll talk about those talks in a moment. But first of all, can you shed some light on what Moscow's real involvement is in eastern Ukraine at the moment?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that they're heavily involved, whether it's 1,000 as some NATO analysts have speculated, or 9,000 as the Ukrainians in terms of the number of troops. It's difficult to say, but there's no question that there's Russian troops there, and there's a tremendous amount of Russian heavy weaponry that's flowed into Ukraine. It's been documented very clearly both on social media, people on the ground. It's almost the height of cynicism to actually deny that there are not significant Russian presence, troops, and military equipment in the region.
Can you put an estimate, or guess, I suppose it is, really, what President Putin's intentions are? I mean, have we come a long way since those first protests in Kiev all those months ago?
I think my opinion is that Putin's intentions have largely remained the same from the beginning of the crisis. His tactics may have changed, but the actual intentions and end game have not. Russia's ultimate objective is to keep Ukraine out of the Western alliance system. Ukraine is essentially a fundamental, almost existential interest to the Russian state and to Moscow, and it's for Russia, it's simply unacceptable that they could comprehend that Ukraine would for example, join NATO. So all of this is ultimately about pressuring Kiev to come to the table on a settlement that protects what Moscow sees as its interests. And there may be times where the Russians decide to escalate and then pull back, escalate, pull back, but the ultimate end game is to create Ukraine as essentially a neutral buffer state between itself and the West.
What about the analysis then that really what Moscow wants is to annex bits and pieces of Ukraine, as we saw with Crimea?
I don't think they actually want to annex it. There's a number of reasons why that wouldn't make sense for them. For one thing, the sheer costs of taking over and rebuilding the Donbas region are going to be in the tens and billions of dollars between both the rebuilding and the social costs. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think if they tried to annex it, there would be a severe escalation in sanctions, which would do further damage to the Russian economy. So I think Russia is perfectly happy to use the region, to use the Donbas as essentially a Trojan horse, to have a say in Ukraine's future and to neutralize Ukraine, but I don't think they want to actually annex it. And there was one actually interesting thing. No one knows exactly what Putin's proposal is, which was carried to Kiev by Merkel and Hollande. But one thing that has been talked about is that Ukraine would retain responsibility for the social and pension costs of the Donbas region, which is an indication that Putin doesn't want to actually annex it, would be happy to leave it de jure within Ukraine, but would rather have the Kiev responsible for the costs. So that's what I think his ultimate objective is: leave Ukraine intact, but leave it intact on his terms.
What are the best hopes for these crisis talks, then, which we've said have apparently come to an end in Moscow tonight?
I think the best hope is that there's some kind of ceasefire that essentially freezes the conflict for the time being. I don't think there's going to be a final resolution that comes out of this tonight, and I think there would, even in a best-case scenario, I think there would be hard negotiations ahead. But I think at this point, the sheer brutality and bloodshed that has emerged has essentially pushed the Europeans to really try and find some type of solution that at least puts a ceasefire on it and freezes the conflict in place, while maybe more detailed negotiations on exactly what the future of the region will be.
President Hollande has said that diplomacy cannot go on indefinitely, but how much more mileage do you think there is in diplomatic talks?
I think there is still a fair amount of mileage that can happen. I think both Putin, but especially Poroshenko in Kiev, are facing certain constraints from their right wing, from nationalists in their own countries. I think Poroshenko realizes this is not a war that Ukraine can win. And I think he would be willing to make concessions, perhaps even further concessions. One has that sense, but the problem is politically within Ukraine, that's going to be very difficult for him. There really is no alternative but negotiations. The other alternative is NATO weapons to Ukraine, which has been talked about a lot in Washington, which in turn would cause the Russians almost certainly to further escalate and would lead to even a higher degree of bloodshed. So I think negotiations will continue to be ongoing for some time, maybe in fits and starts, but the best we can hope to see out of what happens in Moscow out of today is that the conflict freezes in place with a ceasefire while more in-depth negotiations on final status happen over the next few months. That's the best case.
We hear from the Kremlin that the next contact between Russia, Germany and France will be on Sunday by phone. Be interesting to see what's come out of tonight's talks in Moscow. Joshua Cohen from the Moscow Times, we appreciate you talking to us this evening. Thank you.